The manila envelope landed on my kitchen table at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew my marriage was over before I even opened it. Detective Sarah Chen had been following my husband Marcus for 3 weeks, and the weight of that envelope told me everything I needed to know about what she'd discovered. But I wasn't prepared for the first photograph. It wasn't Marcus with another woman. It wasn't Marcus in some compromising position at a hotel. It was Marcus walking into a law office, carrying a briefcase, looking determined and purposeful in a way I hadn't seen in months. The photo was time-stamped last Thursday at 10:30 a.m., exactly when Marcus had told me he was in back-to-back client meetings that would keep him busy all day. My hands started shaking as I flipped through more photos. Marcus at what looked like a business lunch with 3 people I didn't recognize. Marcus signing documents at a conference table. Marcus shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a downtown office building. And then the photo that made me physically sick. Marcus loading boxes into his car from what appeared to be a storage unit I'd never known existed. Detective Chen had included a detailed report with the photos. Marcus wasn't having an affair. He was planning to disappear. The business lunch had been with a lawyer, an accountant, and a real estate agent. The documents he'd been signing were divorce papers, financial asset transfers, and a lease agreement for an apartment in another state. The storage unit contained belongings he'd been secretly moving out of our house over the past 2 months. Marcus wasn't cheating on me. He was abandoning me. I'd hired Detective Chen 3 weeks ago because I suspected my husband of 7 years was having an affair. He'd been distant, secretive, taking calls in other rooms, working late more often than usual. Classic signs that every woman recognizes but hopes she's wrong about. Instead, I'd discovered something worse. Marcus had been systematically planning his exit from our marriage without giving me any indication that he wanted to leave. The report was thorough and devastating. Detective Chen had documented Marcus's daily activities for 3 weeks, creating a timeline of deception that went back months. 6 months ago, Marcus had opened a bank account in his name only and had been transferring small amounts of money from our joint accounts. 4 months ago, Marcus had rented a storage unit and had been gradually moving his personal belongings there during his supposed work trips. 3 months ago, Marcus had consulted with a divorce lawyer and had begun the process of filing papers. 2 months ago, Marcus had signed a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver, scheduled to begin next month. 1 month ago, Marcus had started liquidating investments I didn't even know he had access to. My husband of 7 years had been planning to leave me for 6 months, and I'd had no idea. Detective Chen had also included financial records that painted a picture of systematic financial betrayal. Marcus had been hiding money, moving assets, and preparing to leave me with as little as possible. The joint savings account I thought contained $40,000 actually contained $3,000. Marcus had been draining it slowly, $2,000 at a time, for months. The retirement account I thought we were building together had been emptied and transferred to an account in his name only. The life insurance policy I thought protected both of us had been changed to list his sister as the beneficiary instead of me. I spent the next hour going through every document Detective Chen had provided, trying to understand the scope of Marcus's deception. What I found was a man who had been planning his escape with the precision of a military operation. Marcus had researched Colorado divorce laws and had discovered that if he established residency there before filing, he could avoid certain financial obligations he would have in our home state. He'd been building a case for why he deserved the majority of our marital assets, documenting my spending habits, my work schedule, even my social activities in ways that could be used against me in court. He'd taken photos of our house, our belongings, our financial documents, evidence gathering for a divorce I didn't know was coming. Most devastating of all, Marcus had been meeting with his lawyer every Thursday for the past 3 months, strategizing about how to minimize his financial exposure and maximize his chances of a favorable settlement. Every Thursday when he'd told me he was working late, he'd actually been plotting against me. I thought about all the times over the past 6 months when Marcus had seemed distracted or distant. Times when I'd asked if everything was okay and he'd assured me he was just stressed about work. Times when I'd suggested we spend more time together and he'd said he was too busy with client demands. He hadn't been stressed about work. He'd been stressed about maintaining his deception while planning his escape. When Marcus came home that evening, I was sitting at our kitchen table with Detective Chen's report spread out in front of me. He walked through the door looking tired and distracted, carrying his briefcase and laptop bag like he did every night. "Hey, babe," he said, barely glancing at me as he headed toward the stairs. "How was your day?" "Interesting," I said, watching his face carefully. "I learned some things about you today." Something in my tone made him stop and look at me more closely. That's when he saw the photos and documents on the table. Marcus's face went completely white. He set down his briefcase and stared at the evidence of his secret plans laid out between us. "Where did you get these?" "I hired a private investigator." "You hired someone to spy on me?" "I hired someone to follow my husband because I thought he was having an affair. Instead, I discovered he's been planning to abandon me for 6 months." Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from me, looking like a man whose carefully laid plans had just collapsed around him. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Tell you what?" "That you're leaving me, that you've rented an apartment in Denver, that you've been moving our money into accounts I can't access, that you've been planning a divorce for months while pretending to be a loving husband." Marcus was quiet for a long time, probably calculating how much I knew, what he could still deny. "I was going to tell you next week." "Tell me what exactly?" "That I want a divorce, that I've been unhappy in our marriage for a long time, that I think we'd both be better off apart." "And you decided this 6 months ago, but chose not to share it with me until after you'd hidden all our money and hired a team of professionals to help you screw me over in the settlement." I was protecting myself. "From what?" "From you trying to take everything in the divorce." I stared at my husband, trying to process his words. "Marcus, you've been systematically stealing from our joint accounts and hiding assets, and you think I'm the one who would take everything." "I've been making sure I don't lose everything I've worked for." "Everything we've worked for. This is a marriage, not a business partnership you can dissolve secretly." I pulled out one of the photos Detective Chen had taken. "This is you loading boxes into your car from a storage unit. How long have you been moving your things out of our house?" "A few months." "Which things?" "Personal items. Things that belonged to me before we got married." "And things that belonged to us during our marriage?" Marcus was quiet. "The golf clubs I bought you for your birthday, the watch you got for our anniversary, the books, the electronics, the artwork we picked out together. You've been stealing from our shared life to furnish your secret new life." "I wasn't stealing. I was taking things that were important to me." "Without telling your wife that you were planning to leave her?" "Because I knew you'd try to stop me." "I would have tried to save our marriage. There's a difference." I showed him more photos from the detective's report. "This is you at a restaurant with your lawyer, your accountant, and a real estate agent. You've assembled a whole team to help you disappear." "I needed professional help to handle the legal and financial aspects." "You needed professional help to betray your wife without getting caught." "I needed professional help to protect my interests." "What about my interests? What about our marriage vows? What about the 7 years we've spent building a life together? What about the fact that you've been treating me like a roommate instead of a husband for the past 2 years?" Marcus's accusation stung because it contained some truth. "We had grown more distant lately. We'd gotten comfortable, stopped making romantic gestures, fallen into routines that left little room for passion or spontaneity." "Marcus, if you were unhappy with our marriage, why didn't you talk to me about it?" "I tried. Remember when I suggested we go to couples counseling? You said we didn't need it." I remembered that conversation, but I'd remembered it differently. I thought Marcus was just going through a rough patch at work and needed support, not that he was questioning our entire marriage. "One suggestion about counseling doesn't justify 6 months of secret planning to abandon me." "It wasn't the only time I tried to bring up problems." "When else?" "When I mentioned feeling like we'd grown apart. When I said I missed the connection we used to have. When I asked if you were happy with how things were between us." I thought about those conversations. I'd dismissed his concerns as temporary stress, had assumed we'd work through whatever issues he was having without major interventions. "Even if I was dismissive of your concerns, that doesn't justify lying to me for 6 months while you planned to disappear." "I wasn't planning to disappear. I was planning to leave honestly, but I needed to make sure I could support myself afterward." "By stealing our joint savings and hiding assets from me? By making sure I had enough money to start over?" "What about my ability to start over? Did you consider what it would be like for me to discover that my husband had been planning to leave me while simultaneously making sure I'd have as little as possible to rebuild my life?" Marcus was quiet. "The apartment in Denver," I said. When were you planning to move there? Next month. Were you going to tell me before you left? Or was I going to come home one day to find you gone? I was going to tell you next week and give you time to process everything before I actually moved. How generous of you. A week's notice that my 7-year marriage was ending? I thought it would be easier for both of us if I had a plan in place instead of just telling you I was unhappy and leaving you to wonder what would happen next. It would have been easier for both of us if you'd talked to me about being unhappy instead of hiring professionals to help you abandon me. The conversation continued for another hour. Marcus admitted that he'd been planning his exit for months, that he'd consulted with experts about how to minimize his financial obligations, that he'd been moving money and belongings without my knowledge. But he also admitted that he'd been genuinely unhappy in our marriage and had felt unable to talk to me about it directly. Why Denver? I asked. Because it's far enough away that I won't constantly be reminded of our life together, but close enough that I can still visit family and friends. You've been planning to move to a different state without telling me. I've been planning to start a new chapter of my life. What about my chapter? What about the life we built together? What about the fact that we haven't been happy together for a long time? Marcus was partially right, and that made everything more complicated. We had grown apart. We had stopped communicating effectively. We had fallen into routines that left both of us feeling unfulfilled. But his solution had been to plan a secret escape instead of working on our problems together. "The private investigator," he said at one point. "How long have you been having me followed?" 3 weeks. What made you suspicious? You've been distant, secretive, taking calls in other rooms. I thought you were having an affair. I was having an affair, with the idea of a different life. That's not the same thing as cheating with another person. Isn't it? I've been emotionally investing in a future that doesn't include you. I've been fantasizing about being single, about living in a different state, about starting over completely. Marcus was right. What he'd been doing was a form of emotional infidelity, even if there wasn't another woman involved. The divorce papers were filed 3 weeks later, but not the ones Marcus had prepared with his secret legal team. I hired my own lawyer and fought for a fair settlement that reflected the reality of our shared assets and financial contributions. Marcus's attempts to hide money and transfer assets actually worked against him in court. The judge was not impressed with his systematic deception and awarded me a larger portion of our marital assets than I would have received in an amicable divorce. Marcus moved to Denver as planned, but without the financial advantage he'd been trying to secure through his secret planning. 6 months later, I learned that Marcus's careful planning had been influenced by someone else. Not a romantic partner, but a divorced friend who had filled his head with horror stories about vindictive ex-wives and unfair divorce settlements. Marcus had been convinced that I would try to destroy him financially if he asked for a divorce honestly, so he decided to protect himself by striking first. The irony was devastating. Marcus had been so afraid of an ugly divorce that he'd created the exact conditions for the ugly divorce he'd been trying to avoid. A year after the divorce, I started dating again. James was different from Marcus, more direct about his feelings, more communicative about problems before they became crises. When James had concerns about our relationship, he brought them up immediately instead of letting them fester. "I want us to always be honest with each other," James told me, "even when the conversations are difficult." The private investigator who had exposed Marcus's secret plans had taught me that deception is often more damaging than the problems people are trying to avoid through deception. The detective's report had documented 3 weeks of Marcus's secret activities, but what it had really revealed was 6 months of systematic betrayal disguised as marriage preservation. I learned that hiring a private investigator isn't just about catching someone in the act of betrayal. Sometimes it's about documenting the slow, careful process of someone dismantling a life you thought you were building together. The photos of Marcus at lawyers' offices and storage units weren't evidence of a moment of weakness or poor judgment. They were evidence of sustained, calculated preparation for abandonment. The manila envelope that ended my marriage contained photos of my husband preparing to abandon me, but it also contained the information I needed to prepare for my own future, one that would be built on honesty instead of careful deception.